Good morning. It's News from the Roots on Mountain Stream TV. Today is Friday, October 5th, 2018. This morning we have Dr. Enrique Gomez with us once again.
Okay, thank you for having me again.
And we're going to be talking about an important upcoming event in Franklin on October 15th, the Mountain Moral Monday. So let's talk about the genesis of this event. Of course, Mountain Moral Monday is an extension of the Moral Monday movement that's been taking place for years. Originated by Dr. William Barber III, and now continued under Dr. Anthony Spearman, who will be the keynote speaker. What are the issues that we're dealing with at this Mountain Moral Monday?
Sure. Well, just as a little parenthesis, I believe it was yesterday, it was announced that the Bishop, William Barber now, he's a bishop now, received a MacArthur Genius Grant, for all of that. So in order to show of honor and to help support his work that he has done, along with people from the Repairs of the Breach and the was called the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival. And it's an important acknowledgement from people in terms of the work that he's doing. But in terms of the history, and you and I were sort of involved in this some years back. Back in 2013, William Barber, then president of the state convention of the NAACP in North Carolina, NAACP, sort of mobilized the very broad coalition of people under the umbrella of the HKONJ, Historic Thousands on Jones Street, that had already been established and had been doing work for many years, essentially show of mobilizing people to protest on Mondays on a regular basis many extreme pieces of legislation that were being passed by a Republican-dominated General Assembly in the State House in North Carolina. And then we had a Republican government that essentially was rubber stamping whatever was coming along this stuff. Many of these policies involve essentially defunding many key pieces of social programs, education, as well as essentially creating extreme pieces of legislation that essentially discouraged the vote from segments of the population. They were trying to, fairly explicitly at this point, historically, you will see people acknowledging that they were trying to do is essentially dismantle or attack the Obama coalition that helped Barack Obama win back in 2008 at the time. So that's sort of the genesis of this. But then it became much broader than just electoral politics. It essentially it's a nonpartisan movement. You essentially called on things that were done even before the Republicans came into power in 2010 in the State House. Many sort of policies and deficiencies in terms of government. Here in the mountains, and you and I show of experiences, there was also a huge response with mobilizations in Nashville and with the founding of several new branches of the NAACP here in Jackson County, as well as the show of and Jancy Mitchell, as well as a show of organizing in Haywood and Transylvania, and revitalization of the Henderson and Buncombe County branch. All of that mainly because there at that moment in time, it was the NAACP, the state NAACP, that had both show the resources, the infrastructure, and essentially a moral framework, political framework by which you interpret what was going on and mobilizing people into action. So this has started in 2013, and since then, not only has it been a show of a regular feature of North Carolina, it also has spread in several surrounding states and across the movement, across the nation. And you can say that the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, was essentially it's kind of like a national implementation of the moral movement, the Forward Together Moral Monday movement that started here in North Carolina. So when you, for instance, talk to people who founded the Jancy Mitchell branch or people here in Jackson County, you saw that the impetus there, even though that the NAACP is explicitly a movement or an organization going back 109 years to fight against essentially racism, to create and implement this vision of society free of discrimination based on race. The realization was that the issues that we were facing with, the institutions, the elements in power, both in government as well as outside of government, that were essentially were keeping people down, that were denying access to education and healthcare, and the resources that people need in order to live, access to livable wages, affordable housing. Essentially, what we have, the entire prison infrastructure industry that we have, that essentially keeps huge proportion of our population behind bars, disproportionately people of color as well. All of these things were essentially centered around the same structure of power. And what we needed to do was create a fusion movement that of people who were experiencing as were essentially being victimized and impacted by many of the same politics or the same policies or the same people in power. So we have chugged along. We have, it was a movement that carried out now for some time now, and we are bringing this in the mountains. We have been very spectacularly successful, I feel, in North Carolina in mobilizing in urban areas. What the state NAACP, and I'm a member of the executive committee of the state convention of the NAACP, our realization is that what we needed to do now is that we needed to branch out outside of the cities and start to address what's going on in rural areas of the state. Essentially, we're talking about infrastructure issues. We're talking about the impact of ecological devastation from various industries. And now that we are seeing the impact of Hurricane Florence in the eastern part of the state, we are realizing just how vulnerable we are. And our rural communities, whether we're talking about African Americans or whites or Latino communities, they are particularly vulnerable to ecological devastation. So we have come to realize, even before Florence, way before Florence, that we need to have a presence in the mountains. So our goal this year was to create the westernmost Moral Monday in the state. So we had one 2 years ago in 2016 here in Silva. We're pushing just a little bit further west out there into a community that I feel has been quite a bit impacted by many of these extremist policies. So that was sort of the focus of that. And going back to your original question, what is going to be the focus of all this stuff? So essentially, we have partnered with many coalitions, non-partisan groups throughout the area that have done some of the work for us, in a sense, excellent work. And I'm thinking, for instance, of Down Home, and you, for instance, have hosted here in Mountain Stream, have hosted members of Down Home to talk about what is it that they're working with. So essentially, we're all working together a way in terms of identifying what's going on. And here in this particular geographic area, the things that really are impacting people the most. We're talking, for instance, about the crisis of affordable housing in the area. So it is not just a city situation across the country. It's also beginning to impact rural communities in the sense that it is really hard to find affordable housing. Nowhere in this area can a person that works 40 hours a week, minimum wage, nobody can afford a 2-bedroom apartment, for instance, to rent a 2-bedroom apartment. And getting a mortgage, and buying a house is almost out of the question. The other thing that is impacting this area is essentially living wage. When you look at, for instance, studies that have shown since 2008 in the westernmost counties, I'm thinking specifically Jackson County, but this is going to be true, almost true all throughout this region, is that the poverty rates have gone up. The wages, even though that we have historically low unemployment, nevertheless the wages have not kept up. And with inflation, and people are finding it harder to both maintain the level of livelihood and quality of life with the present incomes, level of income. The other thing that we are looking for instance, is essentially the impact of healthcare. So healthcare costs have gone up. The General Assembly still refuses to expand Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act to this region. We are constantly being denied federal funds that are needed that would benefit our area in the form of making healthcare affordable. You have people that have essentially fallen off the cliff once you actually, if you are receive any kind of assistance, like say SNAP, the SNAP program, or for instance Medicaid and all that. Once your level of income reaches a certain threshold, we call that the cliff, right? You have any number of protections that are lost, whether it be Section 8 housing, whether it be assistance for childcare, whether it be the SNAP programs, whether Medicaid and all that. So essentially, people you have this essentially this hole that people can fall off if their level of income rises up to a certain level. So that's and the big part of it, of course, is for instance the lack of Medicaid expansion. The other component behind this is that we're seeing that gradual erosion of dismantling even of our rural healthcare infrastructure. Locally, the most salient example of this has been the closing of the Angel Medical Center here in Franklin. Last year, they closed the labor and delivery unit. They did the same thing over there in, I believe, in Mitchell County as well. It was Mission, who at the time was a nonprofit, decided to close this. And it has become now painfully obvious to everybody that's following up this story that what Mission was doing is essentially positioning itself so it could sell itself to a for-profit company, HCA, by essentially closing the centers. The thing about this is that nationwide, labor and delivery units, they don't make money. There's no such thing. The argument was that, well, this unit was not making any money, so we're going to essentially streamline and essentially refer people up to other centers. They have to drive all the way to, say Asheville or here in Silva or the mountains to actually have deliver a baby, if you would. But the thing about this is that no units ever make money. The reason why we have labor and delivery units is, well, because we want women to have safe deliveries, for one. And the second part of this is that you want to essentially establish a continuity of care for mothers in the prenatal stage through labor delivery into postnatal and infant pediatric care as well. So some of this arguments are essentially vacuous, but that's just one element of many things that have been happening in recent years locally in terms of our concentration of healthcare services in very large healthcare conglomerates, the closing of services, the closing of women's centers, health centers all across the region, and especially in the rural South. So this is all very, very serious.
And another issue with that, as I understand it, is that Harris Regional Hospital here does not necessarily take the insurance plan that some of the people in Franklin have, and so if that's the case, and some of those women would have to go all the way to Asheville
to deliver their babies,
to deliver a baby, which is an hour and a half away from Franklin or more, and of course that could be a matter of life and death.
Well, if you have a situation, for instance, where you have some kind of like impact of delivery, I do not know much about delivery as well, but there have been cases, for instance, locally, of babies that in the process of being in the birth canal have their umbilical cord wrapped around their neck, so they can essentially choke to death, or
if it's
have
a breech birth,
or you have some kind of essentially lack of enough oxygen to the brain that you could have permanent brain damage. So all of these things are things that require like a team locally that are able to give attention to that situation, and this is not things that you want to find out and then have a child have to be driven over the mountain to the closest labor and delivery unit to actually handle that.
I mean, the truth is that just the trip to Silva could be too much. I mean, especially if it's in the winter time, there's snow on the mountain, Cowie Mountain. And it's treacherous trip, and you know.
Yeah, it's something that's serious. So the thing about this is that we do not Angel Labor and Delivery, its unit, service not just Macon County, but also surrounding counties further west towards Hayesville and even North Georgia. So essentially, it becomes like a big hole. But this is just typifies a lot of the things that we're seeing across the region.
And it's really a statement about the purpose of health. I mean, there are some services that, in my opinion, and I think people who are in that situation realize, some services should not be a matter of profit. You know,
Absolutely.
it should be, they should be done
Mm.
because the community needs that
Mhm.
service, and this is where the government steps in
Yeah.
almost every country in the world
That's true.
and funds the necessary
Mhm.
facilities wherever they're needed.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, and it really is kind of all of a sudden in this country, that's no longer the case. Now, for-profit institutions are taking over our
Mhm.
medical facilities,
Yeah.
and they're being run for the purpose of generating profit for shareholders rather than providing the necessary services to the community.
And the thing about this is that the United States, you hear many of our civic leaders and elected officials stress the importance of recognizing the United States carries some of the best healthcare service in the world. But the thing about this is that it is differential. If you're not in the system,
You have money,
if you're not paying the
Yeah.
right premiums
Right.
and the right copays, and if you are not don't have a good enough plan through the employer or some private service, most of these things are not available. And I was reading just last year something very interesting is that, for instance, the incidence of maternal mortality during childbirth in the United States has been going steadily up over the past 3 decades. So much so that at this point right here, it is safer for a woman to deliver a baby in Iran than it is here in the United States. Why? Because they have actually made a strategic investment as a country over there to sort of prioritize the healthcare needs of women and children. So that is something that is happening here and it's falling through the gaps, and it is something that disproportionately affects women of color, but also is beginning to affect rural white communities as well. So these are all things that the NAACP is taking very seriously as something that we have to tackle on. The last thing that we want to look into, and that is going to be the opioid epidemic. Here in Southern Appalachia, we are sort of ground zero for the opioid epidemic, and everything points to the fact that this is a situation that has been essentially manufactured. It has essentially created that big pharma, big drug companies have essentially sort of colluded to create a situation where the opioids are easily available, overprescribed, and create pathways by which the drug can enter into a black market as well. So all of this stuff is sort of like very serious, and it's a multiple approach to all of this. I'm starting to see more local officials take this seriously, but what I wish to see, many people wish to see, what I've talked to people running for office, when I've talked to people who are presently in office, whenever a chance I get, is that we are going to require a very long-term regional solution plan to this, which is going to incorporate not just, for instance, enforcement of essentially sort of distribution and things happening at the national, federal, and state level, but also we're going to need an infrastructure in the form of physical places as well as mental health professionals, addictional professionals, to support people in recovery for many years to come, perhaps decades to come. So the impact is very serious. Informally, when you walk around and talk to people, everybody has stories about either someone they know or someone who has been impacted by the actions of someone who is affected by opioids. We are seeing, for instance, infants who are being born already with some addiction to opioids because their mothers was taking opioids during gestation. We are seeing the effects on not just the lack of, what do we say? Well, essentially the increased number of people being admitted to because of overdoses of opioids and sort of related medication and drugs is skyrocketing throughout the region and across the state. So we can expect, for instance, in North Carolina, 5 people who have died from overdoses today, in this particular day. And we're starting to see this more and more in the region. So it does require a very coordinated response, and it's one of those things that, it's just not a partisan issue. It is either a right or wrong issue. You either get it right or you get it wrong. We need those resources. We need that infrastructure. Certainly, this is one of those things that gets aggravated by the lack of Medicaid expansion, as well as the lack of affordable health care. The lack of mental health support and infrastructure in our region is something that is magnifying or compounding all of this stuff. So really, all of these issues that are pointing out really require sort of like a nonpartisan response. And every single one of the people who are running for office, whether it be local, state, federal, should actually address this issue in this campaign coming up in November, and should present some kind of plan and approach for this. Sometimes you hear it, sometimes you don't.
And it's important to know. I mean, the Moral Monday movement has now gained a reputation, a good reputation, I feel, or maybe not good or bad, but strong reputation for the depth of activism that it has inspired. More than 1,200 people were arrested the first year the Moral Monday movement began in Raleigh, in peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience, including Reverend Barber himself, and many people in our community, and throughout the state. And although there's no planned civil disobedience for the Franklin event that's taking place on Monday, October 15th, at the gazebo across from the courthouse, incidentally, in Franklin, the weight of the moral movement and the press that it brings and the public attention it brings will come bearing down on Franklin on that day. And it's so important for that to happen because many of the issues we're talking about, the opioid epidemic, the shortage of medical care, income disparity in general, and the issues of poverty in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, don't get talked about in general, and don't get press coverage. You know, the things that get on the evening news are the latest crimes that happen in the town or in the state or federally, and the sensationalist. It's almost like tabloid news that we get on a daily basis. But the problems, the root problems that are affecting a large percentage of our population don't get talked about on a regular basis, and that's such an important thing to happen. As you know, something that happened in the last week, which was very interesting to me, was the introduction by Bernie Sanders and several other congressmen of the Stop Bezos Act on the federal government. And there was all this negative press about, there's no way this is going to pass in Congress, it's unrealistic, blah, blah, blah. But in the meanwhile, just by introducing that legislation and getting press coverage for it, he raised the profile of the issue, the fact that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Amazon and Walmart and other large corporations that are working for poverty wages, and as a result are forced to apply for government assistance like food stamps and Medicaid and affordable housing, and as a result of the publicity and the conversation that was started by Sanders introducing that legislation, it actually generated a response by Amazon, and they raised their minimum wage to $15 an hour. That's what happens when you start the conversation going.
And the interesting part of this, is that the impetus of this is coming outside of the party structure. whether it be the Republican or Democratic Party
Yeah.
as well, is coming out of this stuff. Legislators respond when there is a very broad movement on the ground. When you see labor activists, when you see the raise the living wage to $15, the minimum wage to $15 an hour, when you see those activists out there becoming prominent and putting pressure on this, and the legislatures see that and begin to respond, that's when you start to see these effects. I would like to learn more about what happened in Amazon this week over there. From the little that I scanned, I admit I know very little about this. There was some give and take in the sense that yes, they raised it to 15, but other show of like benefits were show of caught in the background.
Well, nothing happened on the legislative level.
Yeah, but
What
that was
happened was in the private sector.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's something we have to keep in mind. And also is that not every change in civil society takes place on the legislative level.
Absolutely.
You know, that the conversation also has to do with what's happening out in the real world, in the private sector also, and so in this case, what happened was the profile of the issue was raised to such an extent that it shamed Amazon, Jeff Bezos, for their own public image. They had to do something, otherwise they looked terrible, you know. And other corporations, Disney, for instance, you know, Target, Walmart, you know, they're all now talking about raising their minimum wage to $15 an hour, and the same dynamic, I think, takes place whenever you raise the profile of an issue. It shines the light on issues. It forces those in power, whether they be in government or in the private sector, to take action.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, it's like it's people flexing our muscle. It's the power. It's the true power of the people, and to me, that's what Moral Monday movement
It does.
has done.
That's a component.
Yes.
I mean, we don't want to poo-poo the election too much because elections do have consequences.
Oh, absolutely.
But what's needed is that the elections by themselves cannot be the only solution. I think we will all come into a growing realization that for things to actually take place, that you cannot essentially trust the party structure and people, once they get elected to office, to actually follow through.
Yes.
There
Democrat
needs to
or
be,
Republican.
You need to have an ongoing movement. You need to have those civil society institutions out there in the ground, essentially constantly pushing the envelope, constantly protesting, demanding, formulating solutions. And what we're talking now is show of not just a local movement or even a national movement, but essentially kind of like a global movement at this point right here. Well, people here realizing that, well, you know, party politics, whether you're in a parliamentary democracy or show of like this federal representative democracy that we have right now. Some people even question whether we live in a democracy anymore. Certainly, maybe
or ever did,
or ever did. That's a fair point. But essentially, what really is needed is that we need to have that component that exists outside of the party structure. So like that non-partisan movements out there that are not just protesting, doing civil disobedience, writing letters of the editor, but actually formulating solutions. Actually asking questions about infrastructure, basic services, and putting that, and that's essentially how we're going to move forward. So essentially, that's essentially what we're trying to do with the Mountain Moral Monday here in Franklin, coming up in the 15th, is that we want to energize the base, right? We want them to think about voting yes in November, but we also want them to think about how these problems are going to persist even after Election Day in November, that they require a coordinated effort that requires putting pressure on local officials, and it requires formulating solutions on the ground. So we're hoping that we have bottom-up solutions that are really responsive to the needs of the community. So we want people to get energized. We want to invite our coalition partners. We are intentionally raising issues that other of our coalition partners on the ground are taking. So it is not going to be about essentially speaking to one particular party. As a matter of fact, by construction, Moral Mondays in their organizing don't actually involve elected officials. They don't actually involve people running for office. They involve people who are impacted going up there and actually addressing the people in power as to what is needed, and essentially steering their moral conscience and mobilizing people that share those same impacts of those same policies to spur them forward.
And of course, we should
Yeah.
mention vote against all the amendments, all 6 amendments that are
Yeah.
currently being placed on the ballot.
Yeah, we have this. We talked about this a couple months back now.
Yeah.
We have this situation where our state NAACP did our best. Our legal team at the state level did our best to block many of these amendments from showing up in the ballot as being essentially either the language is confused, it is not clear, or gave essentially a blank check to a particular extremist elements in the state legislature for overreach of power. We're talking, for instance, about enshrining in our North Carolina Constitution, show of like a state-issued ID, whatever that means, in order for voting. And if it passes constitutional muster, doubtful. The 4th District Federal Court already have said that such a law in North Carolina in the past essentially targets with laser-like precision minorities in order to discourage them to vote. We have that. That's something that's going to be most egregious as well. But there you have other things as well in terms of judicial appointments that essentially are taking powers away from the governor and into a legislature, and essentially throwing a monkey wrench into that whole process of checks and balances that we have at the state level.
And
in
the
terms
same
of
is
the
true
power
of the
balance of the
ethics
branch of power.
committee.
So this all's really serious. And then it's even doubtful whether the state, the GA, which currently was elected on gerrymandered districts that state and federal courts have deemed not to pass constitutional muster, that essentially courts that essentially mandate that our state redraw its boundaries so that they are more reflective of both in terms of the population, the population's interest as well as geography, and allowing more districts to have competitive races. So essentially, it is essentially pretty damning to have a legislature who has the gall, who's essentially standing, its show of moral, ethical, constitutional standing could be brought into question. It is pretty. They had the nerve to actually subject this to put this as amendments to permanently alter our charter document for the state. So all of this stuff is actually very alarming. So the easiest thing to say to people is that just vote down all of this stuff, and we're organizing as well. The thing about this though is it's very hard to run a campaign to vote down anything, right? At some point there's got to be a component in our movement that says, well, let's vote down on this, but really we need people to vote for certain things. We want to vote people to vote on their conscience for officials as well as policies that actually help advance and improve the betterment of our communities, so that we get to enjoy the fruit of our own labor and our own liberty with this. That is not something that's happening. So we are looking at essentially building up whatever work we do here for the rest of the right up to the November election. We want to keep on building on this right up through the next election cycle as well. Keep on building steam, keep on building our coalition, keep pushing the envelope, keep pressing on these issues and make sure that they are addressed even in between election cycles.
Yeah, there's so much going on right now, and it's difficult to compete in the news with the daily tweets of President Trump and the Kavanaugh nomination, and just everything that's going on. the flirting with war with China right now,
Yep.
and the North Korea negotiations, and the flaring up of the Iranian crisis, and that was brought about by Trump removing the United States from the nuclear agreement. I mean, there's so much to compete in the news that it's difficult to get the message out about the simple needs of the community, the economic and social needs of our communities. And it just points to the fact that you know, the preamble of the United States Constitution says that it's a primary goal of the government to provide for the general welfare, and that's being neglected.
Very much so, very much so. Well, I mean, you do see rays of hope. I mean, I'll just put this as a parenthesis. I was encouraged that for instance, the Nobel Prize Committee, having many issues as it is, so in terms of sort of like ethical standing in many of issues is essentially problematic. But it was very encouraging, for instance, to see that they announced a joint prize, Peace Prize. I don't know if you saw the news this morning. They honored Dr. Denis Mukwege from the Congo and Nadia Murad
Yes.
from Iraq. These are the first Nobel Prizes from the respective countries. Essentially, the Congo for Dr. Mukwege and Iraq for Nadia Murad. Dr. Mukwege actually worked to address the needs of rape victims in the eastern Congo, where essentially sexual assault, sexual violence was actually used as a weapon of war during the conflict for many years. With his hospitals, he addressed those needs. And then Nadia Murad actually put focus on the fact that sexual violence was also used against the Yazidi minority in Iraq by Islamic extremists of ISIS. So what both of these things do is that they essentially bring into focus the fact that violence against women worldwide is a serious issue. And it is hard not to see that in contrast with what's going on, even as we're speaking in the floor of the Senate, with all these debates as to the confirmation of Judge Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court of the country. What's going over there is that we're seeing show a conversation about essentially the meaning of sexual violence, sexual assault, whether that is recognized and whether that is something that structures of powers have to deal with as well. One of the things I think is encouraging about this conversation is that this is injecting a dynamic that I want to see and develop that could actually be very positive. Some language that I've seen people use is sort of the feminization of politics, in the sense that you're recognizing that in terms of feminization, that doesn't mean women only, or that women could only be in power or anything like that. Although encouraging women to run for office, encouraging women to show develop into leaders, and to essentially articulate the issues that concern them is an important part of this. But men can also participate in the feminization of politics, in the sense that what is essentially, if you can encapsulate it, because there are multiple dimensions for this, if you could encapsulate it into one phrase, and that is that empathy is a political value, meaning that you should be able to empathize with the suffering of the people around us, and that your own lived experience of suffering in our political system, our current economic system, actually needs some recognition and needs to be addressed. One of the things that happens with the monoculture is that essentially presses people to become stoic, essentially kind of absorbed the full weight of our income inequality and essentially abusive workplaces, whether through the economic or health effects of this. You're supposed to accept whatever wages are given to you as essentially sort of like your reward for essentially participating this and into that economic system, and you should hold for this. And I would say that there's many people, your listeners in our community, that have to work 2 or 3 wages, that work on minimum wage, that essentially the exhaustion that comes from having to essentially balance your life does create show of long-term negative effects health-wise. So the cognitive load of poverty in terms of being able to see whether you're going to make your payments, whether you be able to afford show of your housing, your power, your heating, your food, your medical bills, all of that, that is exhausting. That really is exhausting. And I think that what feminization of politics does is that it helps us say that, hold on a second, you're essentially denying people the ability to be full participants into the vitality of their community if they're in a constant state of exhaustion, whether they are taking they are single mothers or fathers taking care of children, where they are having to take care of say elderly parents. That is essentially draining on us. So and essentially what you're seeing now with the conversations about Kavanaugh and the Me Too movement over the past year is that you have this cognitive load that women experience, whether it be in the workplaces, in the community, with potentially being the targets of sexual harassment and sexual assault, that this has long-term consequences, that the effects, if they are not addressed, can last decades, that they can be passed from one generation to another, that this needs to be addressed and needs to be show of a serious component of any movement that really seeks to transform and improve the quality of life of people in our community. So I think that's something that we need to look into this, and essentially it's encouraging to see the growth and development of women leaders within our own communities, and then very encouraging to see this new generation of leaders essentially typified by Ocasio-Cortez running out in New York City. But you're starting to see that more and more in our local communities with leaders, many of them that have come to your show and spoken to you in this very stage, in this very chair, precisely what we're doing. I think these are all things that give me hope. These are all things that make me say that we have the leadership, the activist infrastructure, we have the frameworks, political frameworks, social frameworks to come up with solutions. We have ways of dealing with this stuff. So let's come building up. We do have the thing that need to actually save the world.
And I agree. There are signs of hope out there. You know, regardless, even if Brett Kavanaugh does get approved, his nomination gets approved, I think this is kind of the last gasp of the all-male, older white men who are controlling Congress, and I think. You know, I guess a lot will depend on what happens in this coming election in answer to that. But regardless, what happens in the short term is not the definition of what is happening historically right now. There is a shift going on for the better, I think, in general in the public. And that will eventually reflect itself in the government as well. But I believe that the driving force behind that is the people itself, the people ourselves.
Yeah.
And the Moral Monday movement and other demonstrations and community organizing that are going on around the country, the Poor People's Campaign, down home North Carolina, and similar movements on the local level throughout the country are happening right now. That is the driving force. It doesn't happen from the top down.
Absolutely.
It always comes from the bottom up.
Absolutely. That's where transformation happens, and that's where the major turning points in American history have come from.
And that's the real power of the people, and I would contend that it has nothing to do with our form of government even. It doesn't, because our form of government is not inherently democratic. Going back to the roots of the Constitution, those rights were given to a very small percentage of people, just white male landowners, you know, and even though there have been amendments to the Constitution that have changed that and been more inclusive, the reins of power are still largely within that group of people, that very
Yes.
narrow group of people, wealthy white men who own a lot of property and wealth. And the only thing that's going to change, the only thing that has ever
Yes.
created social change is when people get involved. It's very easy to get discouraged and say it doesn't matter what I do, it doesn't matter if I vote, it doesn't matter if I get out on the street, if I get arrested, you know. That's a lie. You know,
Yeah.
the truth is it mattered. Every person has power, whether you live under this system of government or you live under a dictatorship in Asia or in Africa or in Europe or in the United States. What the power of the people is real, and I think we have to begin to own that and understand that everything that you do, your silence is as powerful as your involvement. You know, if you're silent, you're part of the problem. If you stand up and speak and join with other citizens and help to organize, or at least get involved when other people are organizing, you are contributing toward positive change. And I think that's the power of the Moral Monday movement that's coming up on, again, October 15th
Yes.
in Franklin at 5 p.m. Be there. Tell others to come.
Yes, absolutely.
Show your power, add your power to this movement, because that is what's needed. It's independent of what's going on in Raleigh, what's going on in Washington, D.C. This is the groundswell. This is where people show their power.
Absolutely. I agree.
Well, Enrique, thank you once
Absolutely.
again
Thank you so
for
much
a
for
great
the-
discussion
absolutely.
and
Yes.
for coming on Mountain Stream
Absolutely.
TV, and I hope we'll do it again. For a while there, we were doing every Monday.
Yes, and then sort of like school happened, and then I
Yes.
took a trip outside of town. So
So we'll do it when we can.
We do it absolutely. Let's see what we can do.
But let's do it and update ourselves and
Absolutely.
the audience
On what we're doing.
what
Absolutely.
the activities of the NAACP and its coalition partners are doing.
Absolutely.
And I might add that the Moral Monday movement traditionally is not. It is organized and led by the NAACP, but it involves a vast
Yeah, we're talking about hundreds of
network
organizations.
of coalition partners in the social change movement, the economic justice and environmental justice movement are all a part of this.
Yeah, labor movement, immigrants' rights, criminal
Scores
justice
of
reform.
organizations statewide and now nationwide, and what Reverend Barber is doing on the national level is historic as well, taking up the mantle of that movement that was started by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. back in the 1960s. So onward
Absolutely.
we go.
Onward we go.
Okay.
Thank you again for inviting me over.
All
Let's
right,
do it
have
again.
a great day. Thanks.
Absolutely.